Inside a church too small to hold everyone who came, two words hung in the air over a closed casket.
I want to put a reward up for $50,000 for anybody that could give the information that will lead to an arrest and a conviction in the case of what happened.
Somebody knows. In the 14 days between Nolan Wells going missing and his funeral, his family did something no parent should ever have to do twice. They buried their son, and at the same time, they went looking for the truth themselves, because nobody else was handing it to them fast enough. There's a particular exhaustion that comes from grieving and investigating at once. Most families get to fall apart quietly, surrounded by casseroles and sympathy cards, given room to just feel the loss. This family hasn't had that. Every day since the 4th of July has demanded something beyond grief. Calls to attorneys, questions for investigators, a decision to send their own son's body across state lines because they weren't sure they could trust the answer waiting for them at home. This isn't a story with a side to take. It's one worth listening to carefully, all the way through. Because somewhere between a boat, an island, and a call for help that came too late, there's a version of the truth. And tonight, a family in Mississippi is still waiting for someone to say it out loud. This case involves the death of a teenager, and some of what follows may be difficult to hear. Before we go further, hit subscribe and drop the city you're watching from in the comments below. This is a true crime documentary, and every one of you following this case is part of why it stays in front of people who can still do something about it. One note as we move through the rest of this. Since the investigation's still open and none of the friends who were on that island have been charged with anything, I'll keep every claim tied closely to what's actually been reported and attributed on record. Threats have already been documented against people connected to this case, so precision matters here, both for fairness and to keep this squarely in policy-safe territory. There's a moment in every case like this one where the official version of events meets the version a family is living inside of, quietly, every single day. Sometimes those two versions match. In the story of Nolan Wells, they haven't, not from the very beginning. And that gap has only widened with time. On July 6th, the day Nolan's body was recovered from the water off Horn Island, a statement went out from law enforcement. No foul play suspected. 4 words that in most cases quietly close a chapter before it's even fully opened. In this case, they opened one instead, and it hasn't closed since. Because at the moment that statement reached the public, the toxicology work hadn't been completed. The full examination process was still underway, the kind of finding that takes weeks of lab analysis. Patients most grieving families don't have the strength left to offer. And still, a conclusion went out as though it already existed. Investigators and medical examiners are trained around one rule above almost every other in cases like this. Don't rule anything out before the evidence itself does. It's one of the first lessons in any death investigation. And in the eyes of this family, one of the first ones broken. For a mother absorbing the worst news of her life, and a father hearing it secondhand, that early statement didn't sound like an investigation still unfolding. It sounded like a door closing on a room nobody had actually finished searching. Imagine getting that call. Imagine the specific cruelty of being told your son is gone, and in that same conversation, being told that whatever happened to him has already quietly stopped mattering. That's the weight this family has carried since day one. Long before any funeral, long before any reward, long before this reached a national audience, it was just 2 parents, a phone call, and a statement that felt like it had skipped several steps on its way to them. Why speak before the science speaks? That question has followed this case from the start, and it's only the first of 3. Behind that early statement, something else was already quietly underway, something that shows just how much trust had been strained before this story ever reached the public. The state medical examiner's office opened its own formal investigation, standard procedure whenever a death is sudden or unexplained. That much happens in every case like this one. But in the days that followed, Nolan's parents made a decision most families never have to consider. They arranged through their attorney to have their son's body sent out of state entirely, away from any office connected to Mississippi law enforcement, so an independent examiner could conduct a second, separate review built from nothing but the evidence itself. Sit with that for a second. This is a family already broken open by loss, choosing to delay saying goodbye a little longer. choosing to send their son's body across state lines, choosing to trust a stranger in another city more than the process unfolding in their own backyard. That's not a decision made out of anger. It's a decision made out of necessity by people who'd already learned, the hardest way possible, that the first answer isn't always the whole answer. Now there are two examinations running in parallel, quietly, on separate tracks in separate cities, built by people who've never once compared notes on this case. And a question hangs over both of them that nobody, not the family, not the attorneys, not the public, can answer yet. What happens if they don't agree? If the state's findings and the independent findings tell two different stories? Because if that happens, this case doesn't move toward resolution. It moves towards something heavier. Two competing conclusions, and a family caught in the space between them, still waiting. Then there's a third question. Unlike the science, this one doesn't need weeks in a lab. This one exists right now, quietly, in the pockets of the people who were on that island. When investigators began reconstructing Nolan's final hours, one detail surfaced that has never sat right with the people closest to this case. His phone, the one device that could hold his last messages, his last calls, the last trace of what he said and to whom, in the hours before his friends left that island without him, didn't stay with him. It ended up with the friends who came back. The family's attorney raised this publicly, on the record. If investigators are willing to examine Nolan's phone, he said, every phone that was on that trip deserves the same scrutiny, not one device treated differently from the rest. Because anything less invites the exact question this family has been quietly asking since the beginning. Is everyone being looked at the same way? That request was made formally to the district attorney's office. As of the most recent reporting available, there's no public confirmation of whether it's actually happened. No timeline, no results, just a request sitting somewhere inside a process the public can't see into, while a family checks the news every morning for an update that hasn't come. There's a particular cruelty in waiting on information someone else already has. It's one thing to grieve an absence you can't explain. It's another to suspect that somewhere in a file, or a folder, or a phone sitting in an evidence room, the explanation already exists and just hasn't been handed over yet. So here's where the case actually stands, stripped down to what's known and nothing more. A conclusion offered before the science existed to support it. Two separate examinations running independently with no guarantee they'll agree. And a set of phones that may hold the clearest, most human record of what happened on that island. Evidence that, as far as the public knows, may still be sitting untouched. In the days since, a few new details have surfaced, pieces that don't answer what happened on that island, but complicate the story investigators first told the public. The earliest explanation floated for Nolan's death was drowning, but according to the family's attorney, that explanation doesn't sit easily with what he knows about Nolan himself, a young man who'd taken swimming lessons as a kid and had been to that same island before. For a family already questioning how quickly officials moved to rule out foul play, that detail only added another question to the pile. Then came audio recordings, obtained by a national news outlet, taken the day Nolan went missing, capturing the friends who were with him calling for help after their boat reportedly broke down. It adds a new layer to an already tangled timeline, a boat in trouble on the water at some point before Nolan was left behind on that island. What it doesn't do is explain why he was left there, or what happened in the hours after. Separately, a video began circulating online that appeared to show an argument on the beach that day. It spread fast, with viewers speculating about who was involved. But two of Nolan's friends came forward publicly to say the person in that video wasn't Nolan, that it had been recorded too far away to clearly make out what was actually being said, and that it involved an entirely separate, unrelated disagreement. It's a reminder of how easily a case like this one can outrun the facts once it starts moving online. And most recently, federal law enforcement entered the story in a way it hadn't before. Federal investigators confirmed they're looking into threats connected to this case, made against individuals tied to the matter, without specifying who received them. None of these details answer the central questions this case still carries. Not the toxicology, not the phones, but together, they show a case that keeps expanding instead of narrowing. This case never stayed contained to one stretch of Mississippi coastline. Within days, it had already spread far beyond it, not because a network pushed it, but because ordinary people kept sharing it, kept asking the same questions in 100 different ways. Part of what drew that attention early on was a photograph. In images that circulated before any official statement, one detail stood out immediately to anyone looking closely. Nolan appears to be the only black teenager in a group of mostly white friends. On its own, that detail proves nothing, and officials covering this case have said exactly that from the start. A photograph isn't evidence of what happened on an island, but paired with everything else, the early statement ruling out foul play before the science existed, and a phone that ended up with someone else entirely, that detail stopped sitting quietly in the background. It moved to the center of the conversation, whether anyone intended that or not. Online, something else started happening at the same time, harder to measure, impossible to ignore. People who'd spent years being the only person of color in a room, a team, a friend group, began sharing their own experiences. Not accusations aimed at anyone specific in this case, just recognition, the uneasy feeling of standing out in a group photo, and what that feeling can turn into the moment something goes wrong and you're no longer there to speak for yourself. That recognition is a big part of why this story refused to stay local. What began as a missing persons case became, in the words of outlet after outlet covering it, a story that struck a nerve far beyond state lines, reopening conversations about who gets believed quickly and who has to fight to be believed at all. For a lot of people watching from far outside Mississippi, this landed somewhere personal. Parents of black teenagers talked openly about looking at their own sons a little differently since this story broke, about an ordinary group trip, a boat, a weekend with friends, suddenly carrying weight it never used to carry. And still, running underneath all of it, there's been real caution. Reporters covering this case, and the family's own attorney, have said consistently that nobody knows exactly what happened on that island. What they've said is that too many basic answerable questions remain open, a timeline that doesn't add up, results that haven't been released, phones that may or may not have been examined, for anyone to claim they already have the full picture. That's the tension sitting at the center of this case right now. A public that's formed a feeling shaped by a photograph, a delay, and a statement made too soon. And an investigation that hasn't produced a finding anyone can call final. Waiting on toxicology. Waiting on an independent autopsy. Waiting to find out if the questions being asked out loud are finally about to be answered. If this case has held your attention the way it's held ours, hit subscribe right now, turn on notifications, and let us know in the comments what part of this story has stayed with you the most. Monday, July 20th. Center Point Church, Ocean Springs, Mississippi. A building that usually holds an ordinary Sunday congregation was filled well past capacity on a Monday that carried none of the ordinary weight a church usually holds. Cars lined the streets for blocks. People who had never met Nolan Wells stood outside because there was no room left inside, simply wanting to be near a moment that had already reached far beyond this one stretch of Mississippi coastline. Standing at the front of that room was a man who has stood in that exact position more times than anyone in this country should ever have to. Reverend Al Sharpton, delivering the eulogy for an 18-year-old he never had the chance to meet while he was alive. This wasn't a quiet service. From the moment he stepped to the pulpit, Sharpton made it clear this eulogy wouldn't simply mourn, it would also demand. Standing before the casket, he reached back into a difficult chapter of Mississippi's history, and he didn't let the room look away from it. He invoked the names of Emmett Till and Medgar Evers, two names that in this state carry the full unresolved weight of a past the country has never fully reckoned with. In speaking them, he placed Nolan Wells' name beside them, whether the family had asked for that comparison or not. It was now part of the room, part of the record, part of how this case would be remembered going forward. Then, in the middle of that eulogy, Sharpton did something a funeral almost never includes. He turned from grief to action, live, in front of the entire congregation.
I want to put a reward up for $50,000 for anybody that could give the information that will lead to an arrest and a conviction in the case of what happened.
$50,000, he announced, for anyone with information that leads to real answers in Nolan's case. Not a press release, not a statement issued later through an office. A reward offered from the pulpit itself, in the middle of laying a child to rest. Before the words had even settled over the room, word reached him through his phone. Filmmaker Tyler Perry, who had already quietly covered the cost of the funeral itself without seeking any attention for it, was matching the pledge in real time. 50,000 became 100,000, announced out loud inside the service, to a room that had walked in to mourn and was now leaving with something closer to a mission. Near the close of the funeral, attorney Ben Crump, who had stood beside this family since the earliest, most disorienting days of the investigation, stepped forward and led the congregation in a chant. It started low, near the front pews, and rose row by row until it carried out through the open doors and into the parking lot beyond them. Nolan's life mattered, repeated again and again, by a room that had gathered to bury a teenager and left instead demanding together, out loud, that his death not be allowed to quietly disappear into an unfinished file somewhere in a records office. By the time the service ended and the crowd began moving out into the Mississippi afternoon, one fact remained exactly as it had been the day before. The independent autopsy the family had requested, the one meant to stand completely apart from anything connected to Mississippi law enforcement, still hadn't produced results made public. As of the most recent reporting available, that result remained pending, sitting somewhere between a laboratory and a family that had already waited far longer than any family should have to. A funeral gave this family a place to grieve publicly, surrounded by people who'd traveled from across the country to stand with them. It did not give them what they had been looking for since the very first hours after Nolan didn't come home. It did not give them an answer. Once the service ended, once the crowd began filing out into the Mississippi afternoon, the family did something they have done more than once since this began. They walked straight from a funeral into a press conference, because grief in this case has never been allowed to stand alone. It has always come paired with questions that still need asking. Standing outside the church, in front of a wall of cameras that had already been rolling for hours, attorney Ben Crump confirmed what his team had agreed to days earlier in a meeting with the Jackson County District Attorney, a mutual inspection of Nolan's phone. His own experts working alongside Jackson County investigators, examining the same device together, side by side, rather than in separate rooms reaching separate conclusions. It was the closest thing to a concrete next step this case had produced in 2 weeks. Crump also shared a detail that hadn't been widely known before that afternoon. 6 days. That's how long it took between the state's official autopsy and the moment the family's independent examiner finally received Nolan's body in Washington, D.C. 6 days that, in a case already defined by urgency and its absence, only deepened the family's sense that time itself hadn't been on their side. A reporter asked the question that has followed this case since the beginning. Was there any update on the independent autopsy results? Crump's answer was careful, honest, and not what anyone in that crowd wanted to hear. Not yet. The findings were still being finalized. No date, no promise. Beyond the family's word that when the results exist, they'll share them. Another reporter turned the conversation toward the other young men who'd been on that island with Nolan and whether their phones would face the same scrutiny as his. Crump confirmed the request had already gone to the district attorney's office, and that fairness demanded it. If Nolan's phone was going to be examined, he said, every phone that was present that day should be too. What he couldn't confirm, standing there in front of the cameras, was whether that examination had actually started. By the end of that press conference, one thing had become clear to everyone watching. No suspect has been named, no homicide has been declared, and no answers have arrived. What has arrived again and again is a family standing in front of microphones hours after burying their son, still doing the work of pressing for information that should have come to them, not the other way around. That may be the hardest part of this entire story to sit with. Grief alone is already one of the heaviest things a person can carry. This family has carried it while also carrying a mystery, checking their phones for updates in the middle of planning a funeral, answering questions about autopsy results in the same week they were choosing a casket. There's no version of that experience that gets easier with time, not until the questions finally have answers to match them. Somewhere in Ocean Springs tonight, in a house probably still full of flowers from today, a mother is likely lying awake, running through the same handful of moments she's run through every night for 2 weeks. The last conversation, the last text message, the last ordinary day before any of this had a name attached to it. That's not something a reward or a eulogy or even a room full of strangers who came to stand beside her can fully reach. Support helps. It doesn't answer the question that matters most. And everyone in that church today seemed to know it, even while they applauded, even while they sang, even while they promised to keep fighting. From here, this case moves into what may be its most decisive stretch yet. Two threads now carry the full weight of what happens next. The results of that independent autopsy, whenever they finally arrive. And confirmation of whether the phones belonging to every teenager who was on that island have actually been examined the way the family has publicly and repeatedly asked for. Those two threads are what this entire case now hangs on, and we'll be tracking both the moment either one surfaces. If you want to be there the second this case breaks open, hit subscribe right now and turn on that notification bell so you're not finding out after everyone else already knows. This is a story we'll keep following until it has an ending that actually answers something. A family buried their son today in front of hundreds of strangers who became, if only for one afternoon, part of their grief. What they still haven't buried, and what they may not be able to bury for a long time to come, is the question of why he never came home.